welcome you to another Circle Sage funded event. We're very excited today to be joined by Shiri Pasternak for this presentation titled Knowledge Mobilization from Shirk Buzzword to Actual Meaningful Thing. So before we begin, I just want to acknowledge the Algonqin speaking peoples on whose territory the university stands, which is where I am today, and the Wasanich, Esquimalt, and Songhees, whose relationships, responsibilities, and governing authority over human actions across this space persists. And also just ask each of you to reflect briefly on, the places in which you are all logging in from and the relationships that Indigenous peoples have to those places that can be shaping how we move across the territories we're visiting and our visitors on today. So my name's Heidi Stark, for those who have not met me. I'm the director of the Center for Indigenous Research and Community-Led Engagement, also known as CIRCLE. And we host a number of events, and these include writing workshops every Friday morning, writing kind of exchange group research workshops Friday afternoons, and a number of graduate and faculty events and book launches. And so we encourage you to check out our Facebook, I think Instagram, and our website as well. So please do check out those events. And just a heads up that next week on Wednesday, November 18th from 4 to 6 p.m., we'll have a book launch for the book Plants, Peoples, Places, edited by Nancy Turner. There's a large list of contributors from that collection who will be joining us for the launch, including Umik Richard Atleo. So encourage you guys to check that out again at 4 o'clock. And later in the term, near the end of November, early December, we'll be joined by Quagga scholar Sarah Hunt, who's the new Canadian Research Chair in Indigenous Political Ecology here at the University of Victoria. But now hopefully most of you have been let in, so I'll move into my introductory remarks. I'm very excited and pleased to be able to have Shiri Pasternak with us, not only because she's been a longtime friend and colleague, but because she's also engaged in so much amazing work that really straddles many kind of areas of knowledge dissemination. And so I was really excited when she agreed to join us today, because I think you'll be able to learn quite a bit from her about how to think about reaching multiple audiences with your work, and how academic work can have impacts in different ways depending on how we carry out those works. So Shiri Pasternak's a professor in criminology at Ryerson University in Toronto. She's also the research director at the Yellowhead Institute, which is a First Nations focused and led think tank based at Ryerson. And she's the author of the award-winning book, Grounded Authority, The Algonqins of Barriere Lake Against the State, as well as has authored numerous articles and essays focused on abolishing the settler state. She also has a number of amazing op-eds with the Globe and Mail and Narwhal and other locations. So I do encourage you to also check out many of her newspaper articles. So again, today's workshop is going to focus on, whether you've come across this term knowledge mobilization when tediously filling out grant applications, and whether you've wondered why this language of kind of war is used to describe the thing you're quietly doing in libraries and in your room. And so she asks, what can you do beyond peer review publishing to impact the world with your research? So again, using Yellowhead Institute resources, tools, and collaterals as examples. This workshop is a kind of crash course, she notes, on making knowledge matter beyond normal academic outputs. So I just want to, again, give a shout out to Shiri, and I know here's where many of us would clap. And again, we're also very grateful. I'll give the clap, yay, very grateful, Shiri, that you're able to join us today. I'd also just want to let folks know that, so Shiri's going to begin with a presentation in PowerPoint, and I'll be moderating the questions. So I encourage you to, and I see Kenya's put a note in there already, encourage you to send your questions via the chat function. And you can do that directly throughout the presentation and then as well during the dialogue. So please do send those questions. And we'll have lots of time for dialogue. So I will turn it over to Shiri. Thank you, Shiri.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Heidi for inviting me, and to Kenya for organizing me to come to UVic today, which is still organizing and logistics and administration, even though I didn't have to travel. I'm also an alumni of UVic. I'm a graduate of the master's program in cultural, social, and political thought. So it's always really nice to be able to be back in the circle. I'm coming to you from the lands of the Anishinaabe, Mississauga, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat here in Toronto, and actually living very close to Davenport Road, the oldest road in the city. So it's nice to be here in my living room, but it's really nice to be able to talk to you and to share some thoughts about knowledge mobilization. Particularly geared this talk towards Indigenous grad students and also non-Indigenous grad students who want to know more about or think more about and maybe feel anxious about how their work rather can have an impact on the world. Since I know people are writing out of often very deep political commitments to change, and sometimes that change is very big structural change that they want to see. And so I'm coming to you from the perspective of someone who's also been an organizer for about 2 decades. And part of what Arthur Manuel used to call a street fighter, he once said to a friend of ours, Chris Albanati, who told him he was training to be a lawyer, are you going to be a lawyer, or are you going to be a street fighter? And what he meant by that was how much of your professional abilities are going to be exercised on the ground where those skills are needed, and how much of this is just sort of vocational, like a job for you. And so I really think and have always thought about academia as part of training and discipline for the street fighting team. So that is taking your love of learning and being disciplined in how you undertake your scholarship, but also being disciplined in how you think about the impact that that scholarship could have on people beyond the academy. So I put together some slides to talk you through some of the work that I've done, and then very, very happy to hear from you questions about, that didn't work, about your own experiences. Where did my PowerPoint go? Can everybody see this presentation? Great. Okay, so my colleague, the Director of Communications at Yellowhead, helped me put together this slide presentation. So some of it is work from Yellowhead, and some of it is my own work. So I was bragging to Heidi that I managed to find a slide that had a gun that was also a book, because as I mentioned in the sort of description for the talk, like knowledge mobilization has become a real buzzword when you're applying for grants. And so it is something that you need to think about, because funding organizations are always going to ask you about, you know, what you plan to do with the research. Like the research is no longer enough. You have to explain how the research is going to be mobilized in order to have an impact, you know, beyond your peer-reviewed publication, although that's considered knowledge mobilization as well. But SSHRC really wants to like squeeze out of you every possible ounce of impact that you could have with your research. And you can think about that in the sort of crass neoliberalism of the academy these days, that everything is about sort of like this corporate community university interface. Or you can think about it really from that Street Fighter perspective of like, why are you doing the research? Who would the research be important for? And how do you get it into an accessible format so that people can really use it and learn from it? And in turn, you can learn from their feedback and become a better scholar and thinker. So knowledge mobilization is a big part of the Yellowhead Institute. I'm the research director and the co-founder of Yellowhead Institute, which is based in the Faculty of Arts at Ryerson University. It launched in 2018, and the purpose of the Yellowhead Institute, at least one of the main ones for starting it, was that, you know, whenever Indigenous issues were playing out through in the public, oftentimes what the media would do is immediately go to the right-wing think tanks for comment on Indigenous issues. And people across the country, you know, that I worked with and that Hayden King worked with, who's the co-founder of the Yellowhead Institute, we're always getting questions for more information about different laws and policies, settler government law and policies, and wanting to have sort of a critical analysis of them as well. So coalescing in this mix of community need and material need for intervention, we founded the Yellowhead Institute, which is primarily focused on generating critical policy perspectives in support of First Nation jurisdiction. And we do this through a variety of ways. The main form of research and knowledge mobilization is a publishing platform where we publish policy briefs, special reports, an annual red paper. And we try to make this information really accessible. So it's deeply empirical research and very, very grounded analysis. But as I'll show you in a moment, we tried to really translate this research into more accessible forms so that people at all levels of education and within all professions and even all relationships with the Crown can use the information and advocate for themselves based on the analysis presented. And I would say to Indigenous grad students listening that if you are writing and you are thinking, you know, I have this particular analysis that I'm developing in my master's work or in my PhD work, but I'm not really sure what to do with it, you can always contact us. And one of the things that we really prioritize is youth leadership and student support. That's one of the main mandates of Yellowhead. And so if you do have work that you're interested in seeing published, we can walk you through a brief, which is only 800 to 1,000 words long. And it's a really good way to succinctly capture the main points and arguments or forms of advocacy that you're undertaking within your own scholarly work. And we also pay $350 for a policy brief, so it's not bad. And then special reports, these tend to focus on specific issues like the First Nations Land Management Act, or an interpretation of the health clause, or rather the implications of treaties for health services. We have one on Indigenous people in the arts industry, in the arts sector. So they range very broadly in focus, but they prioritize Indigenous voices on key issues across the country, whether they're cultural or land-based. There's kind of a wide diversity of perspectives that we want to represent. And then the red paper I'll talk about a bit in a moment, because we have some examples of what are called collaterals, which is like how to extract the main points of research into visual and audio and infographic design in order to really sort of encapsulate the importance of the research itself. And in terms of community responsiveness, we've developed a research model where before we take on these major research projects, including our critical report on the Liberals' record on Indigenous rights that Heidi attended, we bring together Indigenous leaders and activists and lawyers and media people from across the country think together about what are the key issues that need to be addressed from a community perspective, and that also focuses and prioritizes our work. So I know through a previous talk at UVic, I actually met one of Heidi's graduate students who was able to attend our red paper workshop, and it's a really good place also to network and meet other youth and other people in the community who are thinking about the same issues. In 2019 to 2020, Yellowhead released over 70 policy briefs, community tools and resources, and reports in collaboration with over 50 Indigenous writers, creators, and researchers. In terms of our knowledge mobilization and information design at Yellowhead, we prioritize cohesive design and information architecture. So this is like a new concept for me, but you'll see what I mean when we look at some of the materials that we produce. With our website, which is like the main platform that we publish our research and all of our content. The way that the information is organized and the way that the website is designed is really to think about very carefully about how people navigate online in order to find information. So we think a lot about how information is presented in order to inform accessibility and encourage engagement. So some of the main questions that are animating the kinds of work that we're doing at Yellowhead are: what are ways we can translate complex information into accessible, practical, and compelling content? Who can we collaborate with to do this? How can we create multiple entry points into the content we are sharing? Can we create a visual experience to go along with the research that helps bring it all to life? And what are the simplest questions we can ask in order to get at the heart of research? So I want to show you some examples of this knowledge mobilization around the first red paper that we produced called Land Back, which was released in October 2019. Land Back also involved the design of an entire other website inside the Yellowhead website, where we were able to organize not just the report, which we obviously have posted where you can download it, but each chapter of the report also had key summary points on each page and was connected to a series of resources and tools as well. Oops. Oh, I think it went to the website. So this is the, which is good actually, this is the red paper page. On the landing page, we have a GIF that David Carruthers from Plan Lab made for us, which is a GIF of all the mining claims in Canada in a time-lapse video. So that's sort of one form of knowledge mobilization, in the sense that it's meant to communicate immediately to anyone landing on the page what the extent and cause of land alienation is in Canada, at least one of them. And then the GIF runs backwards to show land back, that the process is reversible. So here you can see, you can download the full report, or you can go to the tools and resources. Here's all the buttons that can take you to different parts of the report. All of the illustration are from drawings that Julie Flett, the artist, let us use as well. So you can see how much attention we pay, not only to the content and the research, but also to actually making the work really beautiful and really accessible, and building a desire in people to click through the resources as well. This is another form of knowledge mobilization, which is a map that we built with two engineers called the Minesweeper map. It's the only publicly accessible and searchable map of mining claims linked to First Nations in Ontario and Quebec, and you can use it to search either by First Nation, or you can search by mining company, or you can run your mouse over the provinces, and where they light up, you can click on them to find out everything from the mining block numbers to the companies that own them, to the co-ownership regime, and so on. And if you're a First Nation, you can look at all of the mining claims blocks on your land. Basically, the big advantage of having a map, and this updates daily as well, so it's accurate every day. It uploads automatically at midnight, but an advantage is that when communities are being consulted on development on their territory, they're often receiving just numbers of cut blocks or mining claims, and they don't have a sense of what contiguously that land alienation would look like. And so we've put all of those tiny blocks together. Here you can see 120 blocks together, for example. Here's all the blocks. So those would all be sort of separate letters, and here they are all together. And you can see the percentage of ownership that that company has. So partly, I mean, the advantage of this kind of work as well is, as you can see, it's highly collaborative, and we work with many different people with different technical skills in order to produce our work. We also have our community tools and resources for the red paper. So for example, we're using video, infographics, that GIS map. We made a video on injunctions that builds on the injunction research in the report, which you may have seen. So part of the red paper report, this also sort of can relate to research that you may be doing as well. We led the first national survey on injunctions in First Nations in the country. And that research was hundreds of hours of work between 5 people with several law advisors doing peer review. It was a massive team, hundreds of hours of work. And basically all of that work boiled down to this infographic. So even when we're doing what looks like, I think what seems like very large data set driven or very detailed or tedious doctrinal analysis, it doesn't mean that it can't also be translated into visual materials that will instantly communicate the results and the findings of the work that we're doing. So for example, here you can see out of all of that work that we did, where we found every single injunction involving First Nations across the country and coded them, you could see that 90% of injunctions filed against First Nations by the government were granted, whereas 81 to 82% of injunctions filed by First Nations against corporations and governments were denied. So this is an example of taking a lot of information and, you know, displaying it in a way that is immediately accessible and communicates visually the massive discrepancy in successful grant applications, injunction applications by different parties. Another one of these collaterals that I worked on, and then again, this is also pretty straightforward and something that is pretty easy to do in the sense of how effective it can be in breaking down really complex information and really complex language in an accessible form. So what it does is it takes the Coastal GasLink injunction filed against the Wet'suwet'en hereditary leadership, and it breaks down all of the pieces of the injunction. It's like a forensic where it just numbers the different pieces of it and then sort of deconstructs the arguments that are being made in court and what the implications are. And this is pretty simple in terms of design, but it's also very effective in terms of, I've seen it cited by different people who are writing articles on the situation with Coastal GasLink, because it just gives a sort of direct translation of some of these very important tools that are being used to dispossess people that are mostly out of the public eye. So it's putting it into the public eye and then breaking it down. So these kinds of like decoder collaterals are something that we work on a lot, and we have one on treaties that Hayden wrote that's really good as well. So those are some examples of some of our infographics for the red paper report. We're continuing to do knowledge mobilization around the red paper. That work is sort of never ending. What we're working on now is getting the report into more people's hands, because this stuff is being shared on social media, but so not everybody's on social media, not everyone's following us on social media. So you really also have to be, I think, pretty deliberate about sometimes just mailing things or printing things and getting them into people's hands. That's knowledge mobilization too. Oh. So there's the injunctions again. Oh, I had it already. Okay, so now I wanted to talk a little bit about non-Yellowhead stuff. If you guys have questions about Yellowhead and the way that we try to make information accessible and some of the challenges of that, I'm happy to answer those questions. But also, since I became a grad student, I have also been really committed to doing something that my supervisor sort of she didn't really make fun of me, but she just thought it was interesting. She thought it was like semi-religious, because I told her, like a Friday mornings I had set aside when I was doing my PhD, Friday mornings I set aside to work on, when I was through a chunk of my research, to think about what I was learning in my research that was actually important to communicate to the public, or that could constitute news. And so every Friday I worked on writing articles for very small community newspapers, mostly, or accessible kind of left-wing rags online. Really, I was just interested in the exercise of taking what I was learning and taking seriously myself as not really a public servant, but I did have a shirk, and I did feel like I have this responsibility, like I have public funding and I'm doing this research that I think some of which is really relevant and important to share. So I'm going to try to publish what I can as I go. And what I learned very quickly was the two main advantages were, number one, sometimes when you're stuck writing as an academic, you sort of circle the drain a bit in terms of like trying to understand, like, what's the importance of this? Have I read enough? Have I done enough? Like, what is actually going on here? What's the main point? And when you write an article, especially for public consumption, you sort of like have to figure that in the first line. The first line of what you're writing is going to capture the entire thesis or the entire argument or the entire importance and the hook for the rest of the thing that you're writing. So I actually found it extremely helpful for my writing, but I also found that it connected me immediately to people who I wanted to learn more from and who could use the information. And so it really widened my own circles of support and information sharing, and was a really invaluable part of my education, I would say. So for example, this series that I did for Ricochet about fiscal relations and the Crown, I spent so much time working on this, like more time. I was just like kind of mad at myself how long I spent working on this, because I wanted to be doing academic writing and publishing, but I spent a lot of time putting this series together. And I'm really glad I did, because I haven't really had a chance to publish on this yet, but but instead of that research just sitting on my computer in a folder somewhere, not really, not really helping anyone, or not really out there or circulating, I had an opportunity to share this information, and through it, over the last few years, it's connected me with lots of other really amazing scholars and activists who are working on fiscal relations, and it's deepened the research that I was going to do. So I'm glad I didn't do it at the time. Another thing that is really useful is if in your research you do access to information requests, and if you don't and you're curious how to do it and you think it might be useful, you can always contact me. Then sometimes the things that come back to you are not only really critical for your research, they're also really critical politically in terms of interventions that you can make. And sometimes you get back stuff that's not even important for your research, but is actually more important in terms of something immediately that can be done with it. So for example, I was really curious about how the BC government saw Aboriginal title and whether they understood Aboriginal title as a threat to natural resource extraction. And so what I did was I just thought, well, just maybe one way to find that out is to do an ATIP for an access to information request to the BC Ministries of Forestry, Mines, Aboriginal Relations, and the Attorney General's office, and just see, like, get everything that has the word Delgamuukw in it for the year following the decision coming down in 1997. It took so long. I think it took 2 years. It would cost hundreds of dollars. It was actually pretty expensive, although you can negotiate that down. If you claim you don't have the money, then there's a public interest argument you can make where they'll waive the fees. And in those documents, there's absolutely bombshell memos and emails between civil servants, some of which are now politicians, that talk about the need to quickly accelerate the land claims policy, to deal with the uncertainty in the province. There's roundtables that they're holding with industry who are saying to them, this is going to ruin our profit margins. You have to act immediately. There's lots of really interesting stuff in those ATIPs. I didn't do anything with them right away. But then when the Wet'suwet'en situation with Coastal GasLink unfolded, suddenly I realized, well, I have all these documents that are specifically sort of like the blueprint for what's happening now on the territory, because they lay out this plan to mitigate the risk of assertions of Indigenous jurisdiction in the face of resource extraction. And they can't say like, oh, we're just, they can't deny the fact that these are real sort of logics in their rationale for ignoring Aboriginal title, that it's sort of deliberate policy and part of this longer anxiety. So this article was published in the Narwhal earlier this year, and it was shared, I think, over 55,000 times. So that's a lot more than our academic articles, maybe yours, but not mine, are shared. So it's a real incentive to think about like how to use that information that you're gathering in order to make these kinds of interventions as you can. And likewise, if you develop a reputation for being sort of committed and deliberate and diligent in using your education to be a street fighter, then people will trust you and they will share information with you that can make real change and can really sort of blow the lid off some of the settler colonial governance that is directly dispossessing Indigenous people of their land. So for example, earlier this year as well, I was leaked an unsigned impact benefit agreement from a Wet'suwet'en band that led to writing this article where you can see in the IBA all of the places where Section 35 constitutional rights and Aboriginal rights, future claims to Aboriginal rights and title rights are severely restricted in their exercise through these private contracts with an energy company. So this article was also shared over 50,000 times, which is, again, something that is just in a different ballpark than a lot of academic writing and the way that it circulates. So, I think it's a really important part of our discipline as academics to really think about how we can mobilize our own education and access to resources and those privileges in order to make an impact. So this is a screenshot of a website, my website that I just had redesigned. I know it's like, I feel kind of like self-conscious having a website, but the reason why I have it is because I can't do this on my academic site, but what I do is I have all of my academic work free to be downloaded for free, which you can't do on an academic site because like technically, actually it's not really technical, it's like legally I'm not allowed to share my articles as open access because you sign contracts when you have your journal, when you have your articles published in peer-reviewed journals. It's a proprietary relationship and you no longer own the intellectual property. You can buy it, but it costs thousands of dollars. And so I'm just like, fuck that. I wrote this, and those those academic journals are monopolies, and they are bleeding academic libraries dry of their resources because they charge so much for access. And also, people around the world, their libraries don't necessarily subscribe to these journals. You know, there's definitely uneven access across the world. Not that like people all over the world are looking for my work, but I mean, maybe they're looking for your work, and they won't be able to access them because of these cartels. And so just on the matter of principle, I just put all my stuff here for free. And then someone in my department was like, you shouldn't do that because it's going to ruin your metrics. And I'm just totally convinced that metrics is a thing that the journals came up with in order to push their own cartels. I just think, who fucking cares? Like, honestly, who cares about your metric? I know that that might sound like something privileged to say, but I really think that everybody has to reject that logic of academia, that the value is how many times people have read your articles. Like, if someone has read your article once, but it's amazing, it's still really valuable. No one should tell you it's not valuable because it wasn't shared so many times. And actually, legit, they have found that there's all these ways to skew it. Like, professors like assign their own articles, and so that there's lots of, you know, your metric goes up. It's just bullshit. So I just make sure that everything I write is uploaded to my website so that anyone who wants to read it can read it. And I don't know if that's like a knowledge mobilization I would put in a shirt grant, but it's important to me. That's it. This is like, so these are, so I just sort of wrote quickly down these sort of things to leave off on, or these last thoughts about knowledge mobilization, which are just that obviously by this point in the presentation, you know that I think that they're really important. I think it's really, really important that you value your research and the work that you're doing, and that you try to build in a discipline of outreach to those who could use your analysis. And so these are just some suggestions for how to do that through local and community papers, even just printing up and distributing to people or mailing to people things that you're working on. If you participate in a teach-in or a workshop or a webinar, that's knowledge mobilization. You know, if there's a war going on and you have done research about that war, or there's a conflict unfolding and you've done research about that, like, think about getting together with some people and just holding a teach-in. Even if only 5 people come or 100 people come, that's knowledge mobilization. But that's also collective movement building that can take that information and make it meaningful by changing the way that that conflict is unfolding, and by building political pressure in order to show that you're watching and you're informed, and talk to the media and so on. That's a really good place to leverage information and knowledge. Community organizing, which, as I mentioned, I've been doing for 2 decades, is a great way to learn how to mobilize knowledge. Like, you know, writing a press release, for example. You know, I sort of, I'm an academic, but I have learned so much, and I often put myself in the mind frame of being a journalist, because I feel like journalists will just pick up the phone and start calling people if they don't know something, to find out where to find that information. And I think we can think more like that as academics sometimes, in order to really triangulate our research with like what other people know and think. And so doing community organizing is a good way for us to strengthen our own skills in finding out the truth about things that are going on, and then using our writing skills and our analytical skills to make, you know, toolkits and so on. And maybe I'll just end it there, and see if anyone is interested to talk about your own experiences with knowledge mobilization, or ask questions, and tell me how you're going to get involved with Yellowhead if you're an Indigenous student, because we'd love to see your work.
Great. Thank you so much, Shiri. Fascinating and rich presentation. We do have some questions already coming in, though again, I just encourage everyone to keep putting your questions in the chat feature. So the first one comes from Wilson, who's asking, what are the ethical considerations and dimensions of knowledge mobilization while working in community?
That's a really great question. when I worked with the Algonquins of Barriere Lake, I signed a BCR, a Band Council resolution. I signed 2 of them. One was a confidentiality agreement, so I would never publish anything that the community advisors did not agree should be in the public sphere. And the other one was a reciprocal labor agreement, in a sense, in that I would contribute all of the information and the research that I had done back to the community, that it would be their intellectual property when I was done. And so one ethical consideration is around confidentiality and making sure that you don't disclose information that could compromise the community, in particular for future land claims and negotiations. Especially if you're publishing historical or archival data that they're not prepared to release yet, or that's, confidential for any number of reasons. So I would say those are ethical considerations. And, that leads into deeper ethical questions about who are your contacts and so-called gatekeepers or informants or family or friends within the community, because some people are going to want stuff out and some people are going to want that same information not released. It may not cast them in a favorable light. So sometimes the ethical questions will be tricky or thorny to navigate. And so you should make sure that you have mentorship outside of the community and inside of the community that can help you to forge a path where you feel confident and you feel like you can trust your sort of circle of advisors to make the right decision in those cases, because sometimes it won't be entirely black and white. I'm not sure if that answers your question, if that's what you mean, but that's from my experience in terms of the kinds of ethical considerations of knowledge mobilization working in community.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah, please.
Oh, hi. Thank you for sharing. I was just asking that because I'm just finishing up my PhD, and I know there are sensitive information that people have shared with me due to, the level of comfort and trust that I build over the years with the people I work with. And I know that whenever I put on that piece of paper my dissertation, will be actually on by the institution for 5 years. And so I was just asking that because often enough, as Indigenous people, I think we need to be very careful what we share, specifically on our dissertation, that will live and be proprietorship of this university who actually owe that knowledge. And I found it very troublesome. I think that's where I come from with that question. So thank you for your answer.
Thank you for the clarification. Great music too.
Excellent. I can raise another question unless there was anything else you wanted to add in response to that, Shiri.
No, I mean, I saw Kelly Bannister was part of this call at one point, and I know that she has a lot of experience with that problem of publication and not wanting to publish because of the trust and confidentiality of certain information that was shared with her. Actually, that's the only case I know of that where a dissertation, I think, was withdrawn, if I'm not mistaken, Kelly, because of concerns around the public nature of the dissertation publication process. But I would say, all of these conversations hopefully are had in advance and during the dissertation research, so that the community is aware of that process of dissertation publishing when they're sharing information with you, or when they read your finished dissertation and you can give them an opportunity to remove anything that they're not comfortable publishing. That's also an important accountability measure and a step that I took as well with my dissertation before I published it, even before I defended it.
Great. So we have another question. This one comes from Cheyenne McAllister, who's asking, what would your advice be to graduate students trying to make their research more publicly accessible in the forms of articles and briefs, but are often told by their departments that they should be placing more focus on academically rigorous publishing venues?
I really struggled with this. In fact, I still struggle with it a bit because I always wonder what's the balance of community accountability versus the very, very real demands of academia to constantly publish. And I think where I've come down on this is I actually think it's a false divide. I find, as I was trying to say, maybe wasn't communicating clearly with that Ricochet series I did on fiscal relations, I was like just beating myself up on a daily basis for how long it was taking to organize my thoughts for that article and to distill information and to chase down stuff and to write it up. I just like blew the whole summer. I didn't publish anything, made me really anxious, feel shitty. And then only like afterwards did I realize like that was really, really important that I did that, partly because it helped me to organize a very, very large body of research that I was having trouble sort of getting my head around. Second of all, because it put me into contact with a whole new network and circle of people that have helped me to really focus that research. It's not like publishing goes away. It's always an opportunity. But I do think, having a public profile on the work that you do expands immeasurably the receptive audience that you will have to the work when it is published. And so I think it's important for that reason. But I also think on a personal level, I feel like when you have to distill your research into publicly accessible forms of consumption, it really shifts your thinking from positioning your work in the context of what other people have written and thought within academia about that thing, to shifting your thinking around how to contextualize your research within much broader public conversations and discourses. And I think that's a really important exercise for academics, is to constantly be positioning themselves and repositioning ourselves to understand where we're fitting into contemporary conversations about the work that we're doing. It's extremely important. And it also then, it's like a feedback, then it also then deepens your work. The more that you become aware and are sort of situating yourself within these really critical contemporary conversations, the more it focuses your research questions and your research area and your empirical sites, I think. So I would say, I understand that pressure. That pressure is real. As grad students, you are supposed to publish in peer-reviewed publications. But this, especially if you're feeling stuck or if you're not inspired, this can really help you in so many ways become a better scholar. And Shiana, please submit to Yellowhead. I'm waiting. DM's open.
Great, thank you. And so another question in reference to some of the resources you discussed being created by Yellowhead. Olvi's asking if there are plans to expand the mapping to Western Canada, and if that's been restricted due to limited by capacity or access to info or funds. So if you wanted to maybe speak a bit more about the kind of structures and processes involved in developing those resource tools.
Yes. So obviously that example is not an example of like something that a graduate student could easily do, because it cost a few $1,000s and more than a few $1,000s, and was really possible through foundation funding that Yellowhead has. But it is expensive, but it's not something that a coalition of interested parties can get together and do in other parts of the country. So this was kind of a beta test. We wanted to do the whole country. to make the whole country searchable, but there were several barriers. One is that, for example, in Alberta, you have to get an access to information request for every individual mining claim. That information is not publicly available. Whereas in Ontario and Quebec, due to sort of recent changes, all those data sets are publicly available, and you can write an algorithm that grabs the updated data at midnight every night and feeds back into the map that we have. But you definitely could do this in other regions, and you could probably try to fight or make a public interest argument in other provinces that have that information shut down right now to be publicly available. So yeah, that was the long-term plan, but we would need to overcome a few obstacles, and it would be great to see it in other jurisdictions for sure. I should say maybe one of the problems with the Minesweeper map is that it is very complex to load. You have to have pretty high speed internet, and I worry that we built this tool that was built for communities, especially remote communities that have the most sort of accretion of those mining claims, can't access it because of bandwidth problems. So it's a serious issue.
Thank you. Another question that was brought forward was kind of back to the conversation we were having about open access and peer-reviewed online journals. And so Christina's asking if you know if there's a list somewhere how people can begin accessing more of these kind of open access, or I think also just accessing work that maybe scholars are also trying to put out there in ways to make a bit more open access.
Yeah, given how critical some disciplines are, like for example, like in geography, some of the most critical disciplines are like all of these journals, these like super Marxist, radical, like these journals all are part of the cartel, like so many of them. And I think it's because it's so difficult and very unsustainable when professors get together and try to create their own publication projects. So much of the like corporate model is based on outsourced labor. Talk about uneven development to countries where hiring, copy editors and editors is much less expensive, and it's all automated through their systems and so on. So it is harder to find academic open source journals. I know ACME is one in geography, and I don't really know of that many, to be honest. I mean, it would be great if we could publish a list, if we could crowdsource a list and publish it somewhere so that people could find those journals. But also my understanding is that those journals get a huge volume of articles submitted. And so the time lag is also huge for getting stuff published, which isn't great for grad students either. So it's a big issue. I think it's one of the issues. It's one of the reasons why I started to think more about the journalist model in terms of publishing in between peer review journal submissions, because at least it was getting work out there. I had really good editor. You have really good editors. Most publications, even CBC, will take unsolicited articles. There's tons of really, really high quality online journals now, like the Narwhal and the Tai, and the Conversation is designed actually for academic publication. And they are really important vehicles for getting ideas out, and they truly are open access. In a way that even open access journals probably aren't accessed by the general public as much. So I would that would be my recommendation outside of open access journals. But I would love to see a list of open access journals. I would guess a lot of them are in social movement topics, but I could be wrong about that.
Great, thanks, Shiri. I think Theory and Event has like made it a practice now as well to at least always make the introduction of their journal open access.
Oh, yeah.
And they had a couple, I think, editions that did have the whole collection open access as well.
Yeah, and sometimes you can negotiate. Like I just had a edited volume published in the South Atlantic Quarterly. It's called Getting the Land Back. It's kind of like a companion to the Land Back Yellowhead report, but not connected. And it we negotiated that for the first 3 months, all the articles would be free, like available open access online because of the topic. It's all like Indigenous economic responses to the current climate and capitalist crisis, basically. So they agreed, then they forgot and reneged. But anyways, it's all up there now. But that's another thing you can do because there was a sympathetic editor, and I guess they have that kind of control. It's peer reviewed, but it's not peer reviewed the way it's kind of like it's an interesting, different kind of model. You do your, anyways, doesn't matter, not important. But they let us have the material be open access for 3 months, and sometimes they have this thing called First Look, where your article is free to download in the beginning, and then I guess you could just tell everyone you know to download it during that period if they don't have access otherwise.
Great, thank you. So another question that came in, this one from Rob Hancock. He says that you've offered some great thoughts about the decisions you've made about what you prioritize and why, and is asking if you have any advice for early career researchers about how to talk about the importance and value of this work to their chairs, tenure committees, deans, etc.
What an amazing question. Hi, Rob. That is a really good question. I mean, the thing is, when I talk, I find that there's huge differences across departments and faculties and across universities around where they sort of, where the emphasis is on community facing public interventions and sort of like just general value for public intellectualism that are just so uneven and so almost arbitrary. Although I guess like generally you could say that, and maybe this is what your question is getting at, for early career academics, there is a very, very strong emphasis on peer review publication, full stop. Even for myself, I feel like I have concerns about my tenure application in that, you know, there are some periods in my life, certain months where I'm working on an issue where I'm not really thinking about academic publishing and I'm only doing public facing work, especially with Yellowhead. And I don't have any assurances in my letter of offer or by my dean that that work will be valued when I actually go up for tenure. I know that there's efforts at Ryerson for Indigenous faculty in particular to have a different tenure expectation based on priorities that, you know, priorities in the kinds of research people are doing and where they're publishing it, and also the amount of time it takes to do community-based research compared to other kinds of research. For that to be taken into consideration in their tenure applications, but that hasn't actually gone through yet. It has to go through. I don't know what stage it's at now, but I know it hasn't been approved yet. So I'm interested to know. This would be another thing that would be interesting to find out more about in terms of what are the gold standards at different universities that do accommodate and do meaningfully take into consideration different kinds of knowledge mobilization for early career academics. As far as I know, that initiative at Ryerson is the only one that I've heard about within arts faculty, arts and social sciences, although I know in other disciplines like journalism, for example, SRC is very much weighted towards, considers as equally policy reports, journalism, obviously, but also other kinds of community facing writing. So I do think this is a fight that needs to be had. Let me put it that way. Because everything I'm saying could just be thrown out the window if people are too scared to risk spending really valuable and limited time doing publication or, like publishing in places that aren't going to be valued by the university, because people need secure employment. That's just a reality, and don't want to be messed with. So everything is out the window unless that can be secured. What I've done, which is like this kind of mixed approach, has been extremely hard and really time consuming and really stressful to try to do both things at the same time. So I do think that more work needs to be done and a fight needs to be had around the kinds of publications accepted for publication, for tenure. Again, I will say it's against the interests of the university, I think, to focus too much on peer review publishing, which I think is extremely important. I really value scholarship. Nothing of what I'm saying undermines the fact that scholarship, that peer reviewed sort of high watermark of like deep thought and analysis, is extremely important. I wouldn't be in academia if I didn't think it was important. But I don't understand why universities wouldn't want their faculty members and graduate students to be the public face of their universities. If I'm writing op-eds for the Globe and Mail, I would think, even from a crass neoliberal perspective, Ryerson would be pumped that their faculty are appearing to be making these important political interventions into the public sphere. So it's a bit perplexing that might be encouraged, but it wouldn't be valued within the actual like structure of the university.
Great, thank you, Shiri. Yeah, UVic has actually, I think a number of years ago, pushed numerous departments to revise tenure and promotion materials to have components for community engaged scholarship, which I think is more useful than this like Indigenous, non-Indigenous binary that doesn't actually account for the different ways in which people do research or carry out knowledge dissemination. Which, I think, unfortunately, universities that are working to indigenize their policies and curriculum get kind of entangled into like identity politics that can sometimes perpetuate some of the misnomers around Indigenous research in the first place. So, yeah, it'll be interesting to see what Ryerson comes up with and then how that ends up applying, right? Because there's been a number of, I think, high-profile cases around tenure and promotion across the US and Canada when it comes to Indigenous scholarship. So great question, Rob. And it resulted in many other people putting in a number of questions. So I'll just go back up a bit to, Rob first replied by just saying, thanks for your answer. And he thinks that the compilation of effective policies is an excellent idea and is wondering if CAUT, for example, is doing that sort of work. Yeah, good question.
Yeah, I'd love to see something like that. Or even just learning about that difference between like that. I mean, that it doesn't have to be an Indigenous, non-Indigenous, because definitely lots of people work in do community-based work, for example, around harm reduction or, targeted populations where building trust is a huge part of the sort of runway up to actual like research or publication. And that's also can be a barrier in terms of people's ability to like publish, be productive, in terms of the amount of care you need in different kinds of community-based work.
Yeah, definitely. And I know that's one of the things with at least the policy in my own department is you have to disclose that from the beginning of the outset of the work that you're doing community engaged work, but then there's like room for different parts of the process that doesn't necessarily produce work that's public in nature, right? Because some communities might keep that work private and so on. And Shirley is also reflected on this conversation, so I'll just add her input, which she's saying that, yes, there's this need to get language into the collective agreement to make sure that Indigenous research and scholarship, including service, are recognized on their own terms, as this, of course, also has impacts on merit and career progress increments. Though, of course, she notes each post-secondary institution has its own standards. So yeah, great to think about both the ways in which research is taken up, but also service. And I think that goes back to the point you were making, Shiri, about, it really is in the university's best interests for the academics to be engaged in that kind of service work as well, for the public and for communities, right? Whether that's in the form of knowledge dissemination through op-eds and newspapers and news coverage, or in particular work that academics can also do with organizations and so on. So this one's a bit of a shift and goes back to some of your earlier work around organizing and protesting. So Stacy Swan asks, well, first she says, thank you for the presentation, and then asks or notes that she's wondering if you have any advice for figuring out research projects that are ethical as well as politically useful for students who have been involved in urban community organizing in support of frontline struggles. And she writes, or just in how to bridge community organizing and dissertation research more generally.
Can you read the first part of the question again? I sort of got lost in thought.
You sure can, just one sec. Yeah, so she says, she's wondering if you have any advice for figuring out research projects that are ethical as well as politically useful for students who have been involved in urban community organizing in support of frontline struggles. So I think the question is essentially around also how do we put the grounded work you're doing into kind of academic conversations that are both useful then for those people you're working with on the ground, but making interventions as well in the kind of academic literature or in the field or discipline you're working within?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there's a few answers. One is that not all the organizing that you do is going to translate into an academic project or academic research. Some of it we do because of our ethical obligations. And sometimes those movements that we're part of can lead to research questions that we can feed into our academic lives, and sometimes we can't. In terms of identifying ways to sort of honor our time and energy, given that organizing is pretty full on and academia is pretty full on, and to think about a way that those two parts of our lives can come together, that's a question that I think is really grounded in your own personal journey, which maybe sounds a bit woo-woo, but I really believe that. I really believe that the work that we do and the people that we're drawn to and the organizing that we find important has all the clues that we need to the questions that we have about why things work the way that they do, or what role different institutions have to play in aspects of oppression and dispossession and so on. Everybody is going to get the same Lego pieces who's involved in that movement, but everybody's going to build something different. And so I really think when you're involved in those processes, to keep, to be self-aware about what are the things that you're most drawn to, the things that you're most interested in, those will be the things that are most meaningful to you, and therefore they'll be the things that are most meaningful to the movement. And the answer is different for everybody depending on where they're coming in and what their position is. But I do really empathize because I know how hard it can be to maintain an academic career and also feel really invested in social movement organizing. It's a struggle I've had myself my whole career. And I just think discipline is the answer, is that, I believe we have to remain committed to doing the work on the ground, and that academic work takes a lot of time and energy, and that we just have to be incredibly disciplined as much as we can in trying to find the time and carve out the time to do both well. And that it's not always easy or comfortable, and it can be really stressful and tiring. But at the end of the day, I feel like people I know who are involved in both have no anxiety about being an academic or worrying about whether they're doing is useful or exploitative or extractive. They're very, very comfortable as academics. So there's not really an easy answer there.
Great, thank you, Shiri. And now just to shift a little bit away from some of the kind of political motivations around knowledge dissemination, I'm wondering we have about 10 minutes remaining, so if anyone does have any other questions, they can feel free to add those to the chat. But I'm wondering if we could focus a little on some of your kind of practical techniques. Obviously, I think what you've really demonstrated a lot throughout your talk is that you have a very consistent writing practice. And a lot of our workshops have been really focused also on both trying to develop consistent writing practices. And so I'm wondering if you can speak a bit to maybe any techniques that have worked really well for you around organizing your research or data, or different tips for writing. I know one of the things obviously you've said is that doing a lot of the journal and newspaper publications have really helped you to develop a writing flow when you're feeling blocked by academic kind of structures. But if there's anything else you can share around just techniques for how to do the work, I think a lot of the graduate students especially, but all of us would benefit from learning any of your tools of the trade.
I've just been writing something for the last 2 weeks, and I'm embarrassed about my writing process because it's so random. I started off with everything on little paper, and then I moved from little separate paper to long paper in my best handwriting, and then I moved into a notebook, and now I'm on folded paper. There is something just deeply irrational about the rituals of writing, I think. But in terms in general of how to organize yourself as a graduate student, organizing your research and thinking about your research, I think I've mentioned a few things. Maybe I can reiterate. One of them is, if you are concerned about knowledge mobilization, or if you are thinking about ways to sort of keep yourself on track for the purpose of your work, and to sort of hold yourself accountable to your commitments in your work, one thing you can do is just set aside a few hours every week to just write through, to even if you're not going to publish it, but to write through what the main takeaways are of the work that you've been doing and questions that you have, and to sort of keep a little notebook of those. You can really, I think it really, for me, was a feeling, it kind of broke the isolation as well of very, very intense long days and hours of research and reading, because it connected me to broader social questions and political questions, and made me feel like I was part of a broader community of questioning. And I found that really useful. And also practical in the sense that then I would take those little notes, or take things that I was learning in the community or government strategies, and I would sort of write up articles with that information as a way to sort of continually hold the government accountable for the things that I was critiquing in my academic work. So that's something that I found really helpful, and really helped my writing a lot, helped my writing skills, helped break down the very dense concepts sometimes that we work with that I think are really important to speak to each other, but if we can break down and decode and describe those concepts in very plain terms, it reinforces their value, because you can see they have sort of explanatory power for people outside of academic circles. So that's really useful. I guess another research, I don't know if there's a research tip, but I just want to re-offer people to think, if they want to think visual, if you are a visual thinker, and you see your research in a way that could be represented through an infographic or a graph or an image or a meme, really reach out to Yellowhead. That's the purpose that Yellowhead was created for, in order to take that information and to create valuable assets that can be shared widely, to disseminate and circulate your ideas. I think that's really it for my research process. I mean, I can only think of the most banal things, which is like my like obsession with Muji notebooks and how I fill them from front to back. And those are the only ones I use.
I love that. I have an obsession with index cards. We all have our weird things.
Oh.
It's a terrible practice. I'm always like, nobody should ever do that.
Do you number them? How do you keep them?
Oh yeah, like the top winners have both the author, source, and pages. Like it's sourced all the way. Yeah. It was some weird technique I learned my first year in college and never gave up on. And so I just have shoe boxes of index cards all over the place.
Oh my God. That's amazing.
It's not a useful way to organize information, but there is something I think about just like the pen to paper that's useful, right? So.
Well, you know who else does that? You're in good company. AOC.
Nice.
When she's listening to people give testimony, she writes out all her questions on index cards, and then as the questioning develops, she keeps moving around the cards in terms of priorities of what she wants to ask. So you're in good company.
Nice. Perfect. Well, we deeply appreciate you sharing your time with us and feeding us in many ways with all this great knowledge. So we want to reciprocate by feeding you. And so we have sent a gift card to you to Tavora Foods. So you just in there and let them know that Circle and Heidi has a gift card there waiting for you. So just a way to, hopefully feed you a bit as you've fed us here today, and to just show our appreciation. Now the sirens are going off around, but we want to show our deep appreciation for you joining us and sharing so much of your great work with us and approaches to knowledge dissemination. So thank you so much. Hopefully you're seeing all the positive comments coming in as well of people appreciating your great words today.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for having me.